Hello and welcome to the Turned On podcast. I'm Angelique Nori, and my husband David and I have made it our mission to break the darkness by flipping the switch on the four most important areas of your life: in health, relationships, business, and in faith. And sometimes the light in the world and in your life can go dim, either from the intrusion of technology or simply because society is so driven by instant gratification. It's our mission to help people see that we're hardwired for connection and that the best things in life come when we turn on the light to see with new eyes the opportunity that exists just a flip away. So if you're ready to stir your spirit, open your eyes, and profit in all areas of your life, then let's get turned on. Here we go.
Well, I don't know if you've heard, but there's a lot going around about things like, student debt forgiveness. There's a little bit of talk about inflation. I think we're sending money to other countries by the billions, and it's a lot to unpack. And I'll tell you,
there's a word recession that we don't want to talk about. We don't redefine it.
No, but I met a friend a little while back. We've been, well, what I say a little while back, it's been a couple of years now, but every once in a while we get on the phone, and we were on the phone last time, the three of us, and he was just like dropping bombs. And we're like, this is a podcast, because there's so much of this that we need to understand. And there's a different perspective. And I even, when I was writing my book, he cued me on to this one word and this one big theme that I was like, wow, as a Christian, I never thought about that, but I'm going to put that stuff in the book too. Mm-hmm. So with that being said, I'm going to let you introduce it, but guests listening right now, you're in for a good podcast episode, because we are going to drop some bombs on you right here that are going to make you think in a different way. So who do we got on the show today?
Yeah, we have a good friend of ours on the show. His name is Kevin Donahue, but we talk about identity, and there's so many different things that he has done in his life. And I'm just going to touch on a few of them, but before anything, he's an adventurer, a truth seeker. We love those here. A world traveler, a husband, and soon to be dad. We are
truth seekers are an endangered species. Did you know that?
They are endangered.
Yeah, so I'm glad we have a.
They're also very dangerous.
Yes.
We don't like truth seekers, right? Yeah. People don't like truth seekers these days. Anyway, he speaks around the world on technology, cybersecurity, faith, motivation, and entrepreneurship. He's worked. Get this. So he knows what he's talking about, guys. Just get this. He's worked with the White House, the National Security Council, Department of Homeland Security, Secret Service, and the CIA. One day, he actually gave it all up, which we've heard this story intimately. It's a really cool story. To move to Costa Rica, learn Spanish, get closer to God, and do mission work. And of course, surfing, which now he actually is an avid surfer, and he has an organization called Surf and Serve that allows him to combine
surf and turf, surf
and serve to combine these two passions. But we have some really, really cool stuff that we're going to be talking with Kevin Donahue about today. Kevin, welcome to the Turned On podcast.
Hey, thank you. Great to see you all. And thank you for the very kind introduction.
Oh, it's hard to not be kind when you're talking about someone that has got a colorful life as you have. So pretty amazing stuff.
Well, I've always tried to live by the theme, life's a movie, write your own script.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to see miracles, you got to take great risks. So that's part of who I am as a human being, and trying to transform myself and others and the world, and live by faith. So
well, speaking of the world, let's get into geography first. You've lived in two very interesting places.
Mm-hmm.
One, which we just mentioned, Costa Rica,
mm-hmm.
but the other one, you had a little address there, really in a place called Washington, D.C. Yeah. So tell us about those, the big difference between those two places.
Yeah, well, I grew up there, and Northern Virginia area in the suburbs, and chose a career. In fact, I thought I was going to work with the FBI or the Secret Service, the U.S. Marshals. In fact, I applied for some of those folks, took the polygraph examinations, but then I got into business and selling, and ended up in technology and working with those folks. So in DC, I sold a forensic investigative search engine, worked on some of the biggest cases, knew the headlines before the headlines would hit back in the 2000s, sold the White House their email archiving system to Bush, Obama, Trump and Biden re-upped on it. So every email that goes into the National Security Council to this day is put on a system that archives these emails, both for historical archiving purposes, but also for FOIA, Freedom of Information Act requests, and subpoena purposes as well. So, I've been behind the scenes. I've been at Langley, which is CIA headquarters. Really the only intel agency I didn't work with was NSA. But I worked with a lot of those folks. So I really have an intimate knowledge of how the government works. My father was a federal employee for 38 years. I have a lot of friends that are still working with these different agencies. So yeah, and I did get a little fed up with it all and decided to leave it all behind and go to Costa Rica to pursue other things. I was living in my penthouse condominium, successful, in debt, right?
We'll talk about that.
$2 million. And, I had a business, a retail business that I opened. I had an online business, and I was selling this technology to the White House in my penthouse condominium overlooking Washington, D.C. from Arlington, Virginia. And I was bored, lonely, and depressed. Like, I was from there, but I just wasn't finding satisfaction. I wasn't finding the woman of my dreams. I wasn't living a life. In fact, behind me is my grandfather's uniform from World War II. He landed on the beaches of Normandy, D-Day +8. He was in the 463rd Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion attached to the 79th Infantry Division, Patton's Third Army. He shot down Nazi Luftwaffe planes. He didn't tell any of the stories until the early 2000s. I really got interested and started asking him, and he started to share. And one of the thoughts that was going through my head was like, what the hell am I going to tell my grandkids? That I sat there, put myself in a ton of debt and followed the rules, I just saw like this adventurous man, this courageous man who built every home he ever lived in. And I was like, wow, what stories am I going to tell my kids? So I went on a mission to kind of get rid of everything I own and transform my life. And, I had a goal of a number of things and ended up being in Costa Rica. So I spent a couple of years down there. Cool. Ended up back in the Phoenix area where I met you all originally. Yeah. And here we are today.
Yeah, you know what? I mean, it's a colorful life, and I love the experience. There's a word you said twice, and that's where we're going to start with in this interview, because I was writing my book, The Pursuit, and I was writing a chapter called The Love of Money, For the Love of Money. And right around that time, we were having a conversation, and Kevin and I will get together and we'll talk about politics and what's going on. And it was about that time that word debt came up again, national debt, where we were spending money, student debt forgiveness. And he's like, well, are you familiar with the term usury? And I was like, usury. It's an interesting word, right? When you say it.
Yeah.
It's interesting. And I said, well, I think I may have heard of it, but to tell you the truth, no. And then this entire conversation unfolded. Let me just tell you, well, Kevin, it is, I'm going to let you say it, but there's no mincing of words when we talk about this. You said, go to the Bible and look it up. So why don't you give us your idea of what usury means and how it pertains to what's going on in our world today?
Yeah, well, I think there's two ways to look at it. And I think this is very important when we look at anything in our lives. There's micro and there's macro. There's my life as an individual in the world and how I choose to live my life. Then there's macro, which is what are the consequences of all of us living in a certain way. When I got out of college, here's what you did. You got yourself into debt. Thankfully, I didn't have any student debt when I got out of school. But a lot of people, they put themselves in debt in school. And then they get out and they get a car loan to put themselves in further debt. Then they either buy a house or rent an apartment, and then they put themselves in debt for the furniture and the clothing. Then they have credit cards, and suddenly you find yourself in debt slavery, quite frankly. And I just started observing, how I felt, and I started observing friends and colleagues. I'm like, my gosh, these people were living in $750,000 houses that they didn't buy, the bank bought it, right? Or they bought it with the assistance of the bank, and they were commuting to jobs they didn't like. And they were, I said, man, and, 45 minutes each way, not living these extraordinary lives and to jobs that, would hopefully help them pay down some of that mortgage over 30 years. And I said, man, this is kind of like slavery, and I saw people kind of, living okay lives, But I was like, man, and this is where Costa Rica came in the picture, is I would visit Costa Rica and other countries down there. And I was like, man, these people are so happy. And they live in these little tiny homes. What's the difference? And the difference that I saw was these people don't have debt.
Yeah.
Right. And so, the whole idea of usury, it's one of these silent, secret sins. Right. And when you hear about the word sin, you're like, what the hell does that mean? It's really a sin as a framework for us to be able to either do things or not do certain things that could either grow our lives, bless our lives, or destroy our lives.
Yeah.
Right. It's not like, adultery isn't a sin because it's a sin because it can destroy your life, and not just your life, but the lives of those around you. Same thing with murder, same thing with, stealing, same thing with lying, because it's not just the sin of the actual doing of the thing, it's our conscience, right?
Yeah.
Every time we tell a lie, something in our mind, heart, or soul, or spirit, however you want to look at it, tells us something. Well, this signal started going off for me around this whole entire world of debt. I mentioned my grandfather a little bit ago. He never was in debt. He built every house he ever lived in. My other grandfather wasn't in debt either. He rented, right? They didn't have the infrastructure back in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s to put themselves in mounds of debt like we do today. And you didn't do it. It was not something you did. You didn't go into debt and with tons of interest. In fact, my grandfather built homes and then would sell them, and he would finance them. So he would just charge someone, okay, you just pay me $200 a month until you've paid me $2,000 and the house is yours. No interest, right?
Right.
So I guess the first thing that's important to understand is, what is usury? And usury is interest on loans. That's all it is. And some people have redefined it as like exorbitant interest, over 20% or over a certain percentage. And it's not true. The historical view of lending and usury is in any interest on debt. And why is it a sin? Well, it's a sin because you're making money on money. So if I loan you money and I charge you interest, you have to pay me back that money plus, let's say 20%. Let's say I loan you $100, you owe me 120. Well, what did I do to earn that money? What labor did I put into it? And the answer is no. Right. And I know we were talking the other day, David, it was about, you're like, wow, I bought this house and I'm going to pay double or even more, 2.5 times for this house over this 30-year loan. Right. And that's just the way it worked. It's compounding interest.
Yeah.
And it's detrimental to a society majorly.
I mean, you know who does it, and they're pretty famous for it. Who does this and is famous for it, but is always considered a bad guy? Think about it. Whose business is usury, and they've written movies. There's tons of movies about it. Think, I'm gonna make them an offer they can't refuse. Right? The mafia. The mafia has made a whole living off interest. If we go back and we give them one of the original things, Kevin, and you can expound on this, but if we go back to the Bible, when Kevin said, hey, look it up. And of course, I'm like, okay, let's look it up. It's in Ezekiel 18:13. And it literally says, he who lends at an interest and takes profit, will such a man live? ? Will such a man live? He will not, because he has done all these. The word here is detestable things.
Yeah.
He is to be put to death. His blood will be on his own head. Detestable, put to death. It only says that about a few things in the Bible, right? And if you would ask pretty much any person who considered themselves a student of Christianity or a Christian themselves, if you can say, hey, what's usury? I would beg to guess that most of them don't know. And if I would say, well, is it bad, or is it, how does it viewed? Most of them would say, I don't know. Well, you think you should be put to death? Most of them would say, of course not. I lend, I am a lender, or I do this. And it really forces you to think about it.
Yeah.
It forces you to think about it. And Kevin, you've had so much experience in other countries, and there's other cultures who still think it's detestable.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. Like, in fact, how did I discover this? The discovery phase of this whole thing is I was living in Scottsdale, Arizona, and in a really nice condominium in Old Town Scottsdale. And my neighbor was a guy from Syria, and he had a Ferrari and he had a G-Wagon, and he was out there, waxing his Ferrari one day. He's like, Kevin, He goes, when I first come to this country, he was from Syria, by the way. When I first come to this country from Syria in 1996, he's a computer programmer. He goes, I went to work for LendingTree and I was doing computer programming. I could not believe that people buy a house for $250,000 and they have to pay $500,000 for this house. He goes, in my country, you go to jail for that. It's extortion, right? And, you know, to go back to what you were saying about the mafia, it's shylocking is what they call it. They have a term for it. And that term is famous from The Merchant of Venice, which is a play that Shakespeare wrote. And Shylock wanted a pound of flesh, right? Like, it's exorbitant. Like, these people, like, you are not to be charged interest or you're not to charge interest, but it's become normalized in our culture. But there are cultures out there. Islamic law detests it. It detests this. In Islam, it's called riba or riba, and they say it's war against Allah. It's as bad as committing adultery 36 times.
Wow.
Right? They take a stand for it. It's in the Islamic dogma. It's been in Catholic dogma since the very beginning. Now, that being said, sin always seems to infiltrate, right? It's kind of like termites and eats away the soul. And there's been times where the Catholic Church was actually using usury, as well as the Protestant Church as well. And it's one of the things that Martin Luther objected to.
There you go.
What are you guys doing, the priesthood and the popes, charging usury on money? And this is one of his grievances. And, you know, St. Jerome was quoted as saying, you know, how do you feel about usury? And he asked the question, how do you feel about murder? Wow. Right. That's the seriousness of this. And you mentioned Ezekiel, I have that written here, but also Deuteronomy 23:19, do not charge your brother interest, whether on money or food or anything else, what may earn interest. Psalm 15:5, who dwells in my tabernacle? He who lends without interest on a loan.
Wow.
Right.
Did you know this, Ange? I mean, when we talked about this,
not to this extent, no.
So how do you feel about it? Get you into the conversation here.
Well, I mean, it's eye-opening because I think it's almost like, why don't we know? And the reason why is because if we're not being shepherded through the word in this regard, we easily fall into the matrix that we live in the real world, and that in the world that we live in teaches us that this is normal. Right. And we kind of blindly trust these systems that then put us in an entrapment or a slavery, essentially, of this debt. And you're thinking to yourself, like as you talk about this and you've dialogued with David, and I'm like, gosh, yes, like, it's total entrapment into a system that it's so hard to get out of. But the question then is, like, okay, so we have blindly trusted this system. We ourselves, you know, have a home, and I'm thinking, well, crap. Like,
well, but we have friends who are mortgage. Let's say we have a friend who's a mortgage broker, or, you know, like, I mean, they're not bad people, and I certainly don't want to listen to this going, hey, I'm gonna be excluded from the kingdom because of a mortgage broker.
No,
we need some clarification on this, Kevin.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. You're just blindly trusting.
Yeah, and the Catholic Church would not give you a Christian burial. Like that's how grievous they thought this was, because it destroys culture, it destroys human beings, it destroys family. Let me read you a quote from Andrew Jackson, because this isn't just about faith or religion. This is about history. And, you know, David, you mentioned earlier, we talk about politics, and I would say, well, we don't talk about politics. We talk about history, theology, and philosophy outside of the world of politics, right? So we take a different view. It just so happens to kind of destroy the political conversation, because the political conversation is what tries to lead us into this trap. It's why we have to take a step back and figure out what's true. But here's the other point before I read this Andrew Jackson quote. Not just that the Bible condemns it, right? Because it certainly does, over 100 times. The Quran condemns it. But you tell me where in your Christian Bible it says, thou shalt put yourself in debt to strangers. Tell me where it says, hey, go buy yourself a house more than you can afford and put yourself in debt to people who aren't Christian, or maybe are Christian, but put yourself in debt to these people. It's just not there.
So
right?
What do you do?
So you know what, I'm going to just read something from the book before you read that other quote. Peter Grandich, who's the author of Confessions of a Wall Street Whiz Kids, he says, the writers of the Bible anticipated the problems we would have with money and possessions. That's why I get my financial guidance from the Bible. Money and possessions are the second most referenced topic, second most referenced topic in the Bible. And the message is clear.
Yes.
The message is clear. Nowhere in scripture is debt viewed in a positive way.
That's correct.
That's so good. And, in Jesus and Matthew, he says, you make your phylacteries wide and your tassels long in Matthew 23, and you put yourself in places for everyone to see you, right? Like, what are they doing? He's saying you're a poser.
Yeah.
Like you look great on the outside, but on the inside, you're full of everything unclean, dead men's bones. He uses this vivid language, right?
Yeah.
Well, what are people doing when they're living in their $750,000 homes or their $1.5 million homes and they're mortgaged to the neck, right? They're acting like they have what they don't have. I tell people all the time. The young man told me the day, he's like, oh, I just bought a house. I'm like, let me ask you a question. Did you buy the house or did the bank buy your house? Oh, the bank bought your house. Cool. I say, because don't pay your rent next month. Guess who's coming for their house?
Right.
Yeah.
Theirs. And then you have to have PMI insurance and all this different insurance. Why? Title insurance. Well, because it's not your house. If it was a simple transaction where you paid, you paid cash, came with a suitcase of cash for $250,000. Here's the deed. It's done. But there's all these other insurances in place and costs in place. You end up paying 3-4 times for that house that you think you own, right? And that makes it also immoral. Where else do you pay 2 times, 3 times, 4 times for the same thing?
Yeah.
Right. It causes a lot of problems. But here's the quote from Andrew Jackson to the bankers, because he was very anti-central bank. This goes back to the macro, right? There's the micro, like how am I going to conduct my life outside of the sin of usury?
Yeah.
Then there's like, how do we conduct our nation outside of the sin of usury, right? Because
and I'm guessing this is not what this quote is probably not going to be on the $20 bill, right? I'm guessing.
Exactly, right. 100%. Well, and I could even pose an argument that the reason the founding fathers started a revolution was because of usury. They did not want to pay King George's interest to the bankers, right? They were sick of it. They were like, why are we paying your interest? So Andrew Jackson's quote says this: you tell me that if I take the deposits from the bank and annul its charter, I shall ruin 10,000 families. That may be true, gentlemen, but that is your sin. Should I let you go on, you will ruin 50,000 families, and that would be my sin. You are a den of vipers and thieves. Using Jesus's language, he did.
I was going to say that's a direct quote from Jesus's mouth.
That's it, and that's the problem they have with the central bank, right?
Wow.
And we still have a central bank to this day. When people say, you mentioned earlier, David, that we're sending money to Ukraine or wherever we're sending it, right? 7 trillion on this vaccine, 10 billion to this war, whatever it may be. The government doesn't have that money. They have to take a loan from the central bank. And then we have to pay interest on that loan. So for example, since about 1950, Americans have paid about $12 trillion in interest. And what do you get for interest?
Nothing.
Nothing. It's just money that is siphoned away to the bankers. We're making other people rich. The other problem is this: when you live in an economy, we call our economy capitalism, but a capitalistic economy based on usury will always lead to communism, then tyranny and despotism. It leads to that because it starts to siphon away all the wealth. And here's what begins to focus on the economy. Pull into any city. What are the buildings? They're mostly banks, insurance companies, and hospitals. Yeah. That's where all the money is.
That's right.
What happens?
Think about who advertises most on TV. If you turn on any channel right now, you'd see three insurance commercials and a couple bank commercials, right? Yeah.
Get your credit score up.
And then ask yourself this. Pharmaceutical. and then ask yourself this. Why is it, well, we could say the American public, no one's educated on this. It's like they put earphones on our
To
ears and a big
indoctrination.
fat popsicle in our mouth to satisfy us.
Yeah.
They say, don't worry about that, because if you walked up to somebody in the street and you go, hey, I mean, here's the thing. We see the interviews all the time where they walk up to young people in the street and they ask them basic questions like name a president, and they're lost, right? But imagine if you walked up to the educated class and people who were not in college, but educated people who consider themselves on the up and up, and they said, what's the Fed? And what does the Fed do? And is the Fed part of a government agency? What do you think they would say, Kevin? The average person?
Yeah, they would say it's part of the federal government. They just don't know. It's a central private bank that charges us interest. It's and it's just the way the economy works. So listen, there's a game being played here. Romans 12:2 says, be no longer conformed to the patterns of this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, and renew your mind in the word of God, right? So this is one of the things that we have to do. We have to take an inventory of our lives. And it's like, what is in my blind spot right now? And I would say usury, debt, interest, riba, whatever you want to call it, that is clearly in most people's blind spot. If you went up to those same educated people, David, you'd say, what is usury? They're like, I don't know. Or
Right.
I don't know, exorbitant interest, right? Like, and you just see, there's another interesting documentary called The Century of the Self, and it's about Edward Bernays. And Edward Bernays is the godfather of propaganda. He wrote
I
the
thought
book.
he was the guy that invented the sauce that I put on steaks. No?
Right? Yeah, exactly. Edward Bernays wrote the book
Oh
called
my God.
Propaganda, and here's what the documentary, it's a BBC documentary. It says, before 1900, America was a needs-based economy. People essentially bought what they needed. After Edward Bernays got a hold of the propaganda on the US, it became a consumer-based economy. So a car went from a utility that you would drive somewhere, get you point A to point B, to a sex symbol, right? Or to whatever it may be, right? So it became a consumer society. I also noticed this, I have a lot of friends who have storage units, down at the U-Haul storage or the U-Store. They've got air-conditioned units for the stuff they don't use. That's also,
Speaking of one, we have one, right? in
they
Texas.
rent apartments for their stuff that they don't use. This isn't something you see in Central America or South America or other countries. Like, they're like, are you crazy? You're renting an apartment for the stuff that you have too much of?
Yeah.
Wow, that's
Good
crazy.
point.
Right? So we live in this consumerist culture. And another piece, like when you fly on an airplane, what do you always get pitched?
Miles.
Yeah, for what?
Credit card, for a credit card.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why?
Great question.
Well, when you're 17 or
Seeking and
18
trap
and you got
yourself
no
into more
credit, you
debt.
got no credit line, and you're in college and you're getting all these things saying, hey, here's a credit card, here's a credit card. I mean, there's a stat that says from the Center for Responsible Lending that 91% of all payday loans are made by repeat borrowers. So what they're starting to do is they hook you in. Remember, Angelique, we talk about a hook, right?
Yep.
They hook you in when you're young. It's money for nothing and your chicks for free, right?
Yeah.
Just like the Dire Straits song. Here's some money for nothing. And you realize it's not money for nothing. You're actually, what they call is you're shackled to a car payment. You're handcuffed to a mortgage, right? You're buried under debts. The terminology that we use for debt is imprisonment and it's death, right?
Yeah.
And that's not by mistake, Kevin.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And if you fly on American Airlines, Delta, Frontier, any one of them, they relentlessly pitch you and they come back with these things. We'll give you 50,000 miles if you sign up for our credit card. Did you know the airlines make more money off of usury than they do off of selling airline tickets?
Jeez,
That's where they make their profit. They won't even publicize it anymore. But I think American Airlines makes $1 billion a year on interest for their credit cards. That's why, hey, here, take 50,000 miles. Big deal. Who cares? That's where they make their money. If you go to Macy's, or I don't even know if Macy's is around anymore. You go to any sort of Sephora, what do they offer you? Hey, are you going to pay with your Sephora card today? We get 10% off. Like
everywhere you go, you can't get out of a checkout without putting it on the card. And we've done a pretty good job at that.
Yeah.
I think
We don't have any cards.
between your background and my background, there's no college debt. We do have a car that's financed and we have a house that's financed. So I can't say it's perfect.
Yeah.
But we don't have any credit card debt or whatnot. But it's scary because what's happening is, like Kevin said, he says, this ends in one place. It always ends in one place, and that place was where, Kevin?
Tyranny.
Tyranny and communism.
Communism.
Because when you say, hey, get me out of this, we'll take care of you. I'll give up my freedoms if you take care of this debt. Or like we said, I'm handcuffed to this. If you owe somebody something, you are a slave.
Yeah.
You know, when we talk about slavery, it's been around forever, even in Egypt in the Middle Ages, and they were slaves, and some slaves that you could buy your way out of slavery. But until you could afford that, guess what? You're a slave. And then by the time most of them could buy their way out of slavery, guess what? Well, you're old now. You know, I just saw a thing the other day when they finally did the Emancipation Proclamation. There were so many slaves that was their whole way of life, that when the people came and say, hey, Lincoln just signed this thing, they were like, well, what are we going to do now? Like, this is the only way we've known. And a lot stayed. And that shows you the mentality. What happens is when people get into a slavery mentality and conditioning for their life, then they don't know what it's like. And that becomes the fear base out there, is what goes on.
So Kevin, like, as I sit here and listen to this, and we've talked about this before offline, but like, what for our listeners, like, they're sitting there and go, great, now what? You know, like, what now what? How do they, what's the plan?
Well, you know, because you're not living in a shack, and you obviously have ambition, and that, I think that's how this whole thing started. Because I was talking to Kevin, he's an ambitious guy. Look at all the things he's done. Look at all the places he's visited. So there's a difference between ambition and making something and creating either a good or a service and getting returned for it, right?
He's creating a script out of his life, you know.
But right now we're throwing a wrench into what everybody sees as, oh my gosh, I thought this was the only way of life that I knew.
And they got to go about it a different way.
Yeah, it's a great question. Here's the other thing too, is what do we all, you know, 700 is a great credit score, 800 or 850. I need to get my credit score up. What's that? That's that slave mentality.
Yeah.
How much slavery can I put myself in? Oh my gosh, if I get my credit score up to 850, I can get a $5 million loans and be a slave. And listen, there's nothing wrong with lending. There's nothing wrong with borrowing. It's the interest that causes the sin.
Yeah.
Right. This is what's problem, because you're making money out of thin air. So this isn't a Christian thing. It's not a Muslim thing. Every single religion, Buddhism, Judaism, Hinduism, Aristotle, the great Greek philosophers were all anti-usury. They all understood the problem with usury, how it destroys a culture. And what typically happens, the cycle is between 70 to 100 years. You know, every 70 to 100 years, the system collapses. Now, what I would say is the system's been propped up 3 times in my lifetime. One would be 9/11, where there was trillions of dollars pushed into the economy, borrowed from the central bank to prop up this economy that was probably going to crash. The second time was, 07, 08, whenever the economy crashed and everything was too big to fail. So they pushed in more money into these big banks so they wouldn't fail. And the last one was most recently was this pandemic, right? I mean, they just pushed in trillions of dollars out of thin air. Where's the money come from? Right. And all of these have propped up our economy. So what do you do to get yourself out of the matrix? First of all, you realize there's a thing called usury. It is immoral. It is a sin, and it will be detrimental to your life. Right. Like the other thing, too, I was telling this young man, you know, he said he bought this house for $350,000. I'm like, that's great. I'm like, and you're hoping that 2-3 years from now, that house will be worth $500,000 and you can sell it for a profit. But let me ask you, what did you do? What labor, what idea, what did you do to earn that extra money? And the answer is nothing. I just sat there and I let usury and interest and inflation increase the price of my house. Well, I put nothing into it, but now it's worth $500,000. So we're all caught into this thing we call wealth, but nothing was created. Then I asked him this. I said, what will happen if your house goes the other way? Let's say your house 3 years from now is worth $150,000. Now you're $200,000 in the hole. Will those nice bankers come to you and say, hey, you know what? We understand. We're going to take the loan down to 150. No, you're still on the hook, right? So it's like this big kind of scam going on. So what an individual needs to do is take an inventory. Like, how am I living my life? Where am I overextended? You know, where am I leveraging interest-based debt in my life to create things that really aren't mine, to put on a front to make me look a certain way? Like, here's the other thing I mentioned to you guys the other day, I believe. I said, imagine that you rented, for 5 years. And in that 5 years, you came up with an idea or a service or a product or a company, and you made $1 million, and you went and bought a house cash for $1 million or whatever, right? That means God blessed you because you put the effort into it. You put a vision out there, and you created value that brought revenue to you. And then you went and bought the house cash outside of the realm of usury and sin. Isn't that a better story to tell as a testimony?
Yeah.
How'd you afford this house, Kevin? Well, let me tell you, I put it all in God's hands. Matthew 7:7 did. I asked and you shall receive, seek and you will find. I put a vision of my future. I had faith. I took big risks. And now God blessed me with this house and this family and this home. I didn't put myself in debt like Satan's way. I did it God's way. So that's what I would say is like, find a way out of the maze, out of the rat race, out of the trap, out of the slavery, right?
Well, if you look at the debt and the slavery, I challenge anybody, and it'll freak you out. Just pull up national debt clock, and it's a live active clock, and you'll see a number on there that you can't even, you have to look at it and start counting because you can't even fathom what the number is.
Yeah.
But the scary thing is the digits move so quick, and you realize that that's every second. If we go back to look at Ecclesiastes, and it says invest in 7 ventures, God wants us to be entrepreneurial. I believe there's words in the Bible that says, don't just rely on one source of income, sow your seed in different places.
Yes.
And so we see, if we go by the Bible, that there's very clear instruction on what to do. If we also look at, we go back to this thing called the Fed, which people are completely unaware of. And we ask ourselves, well, what is it? If you look at the book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, which I'm sure Kevin is familiar with, by G. Edward Griffin, he writes, since its exception. So people in our generation, and even my parents, right, pretty much this is all they know. They grew up with a Fed. But like Kevin's saying, his great-grandfather, there was a time when there was, what's a central bank? What's a Fed? And if we get back into the actual development of it, why it happened, there was always supposed to be this gold standard. And there's only been one time that Fort Knox has ever been open and they allowed them to go into it. I believe it was the Nixon era, if you can correct me or not. But there was this gold standard, and nobody really knows
what backs it.
Well, the consensus
know?
is, Kevin, the consensus is there's definitely not enough gold to back this up. So basically what you have is paper money. And people betting on it,
Well, and I would
betting on whether you're going to be able to pay that back or not, like the cartoon you sent me.
Yeah, well, I spend time in Nicaragua and El Salvador, and people are like, "Aren't those people poor?" And I'm like, "How much do you owe on your house?" 550,000. How much do you owe in your car? 50,000. I'm like, okay, so you're minus 600,000. They actually have what they have. You're upside down. I want to give an example too. A priest gave a sermon, and he talks about here's the compound interest. People call it the most powerful force in the universe. If you took a loan at the time of Christ's birth for $2 with 3% interest, simple interest, today you would owe in interest $122. You took that same loan, $2 at the birth of Christ, with 3% interest compounding, within 1,000 years, you would owe $20 trillion in interest.
Oh my gosh.
That's the difference, right? So it is a trap. It is a beautiful trap. And this is like, I tell people, Satan doesn't come, looking like Satan with a pitchfork and horns and a tail. Satan comes looking like Christ, sounding like Christ, acting like Christ, right? Making promises for you to make you feel comfortable in your culture, all of these things. We are supposed to reject this. I mean, if you want to see how things can work without usury, go talk to the Amish or the Mennonites. They don't participate in this financial system. They're thriving. Now, I'm not saying you have to go be Amish or Mennonite, but I'm just saying,
tell us about what happened during their pandemic. Remember when you mentioned the Amish?
I've told everyone, I said, watch the Amish. If they start dropping dead, there's a deadly virus. If not, They're not doing they don't participate in the American education system. They don't participate in the American justice system. They don't participate in the American medical system, right? When I left DC, here was the phrase I left with, just working with these different government agencies. Love your country, never trust your government. I expanded that to love your God, never trust your religion, and love your doctor, never trust their opinion. Now, that's not to dismiss the importance of having a government, a religion, and or a doctor, right? They're frameworks for us to operate within, for sure, but we have to be able to think for ourselves. And so I think one of the biggest lessons here is, what is, I said at the beginning, life's a movie, write your own script. That's how I live my life. Like, what script do you want to live? Do you want to be the hero, the person that lives by faith? Do you want to be the slave? I mean, that's a role for sure, right? Yeah. Do you want to be someone who perpetrates, like they own a $750,000 house, but really the strangers at the bank own it? Or do you want to be the person that actually owns it, right? Listen, I'm not ignorant to the fact that there's a lot of use, and we live very comfortable lives here in the United States because ease of access to debt. Right? We can all go get big loans tomorrow. We can take out credit cards. We can all do that, and we can perpetrate a life. But what if we cut that out? What new possibilities would be available for us? How much more would God bless us? Right? Like, that's what I think of. Yeah. If indeed using interest and charging interest and paying interest is war against Allah or war against God, or is a sin against God and his son Jesus and the Holy Spirit, man, what are we doing to our lives? What more is out there?
Yeah. Well, what we see here, and as we go into this final segment here, what we see again is a generation that has grown up with this Fed, grown up with interest. It's a part of their life. They know nothing different. And sometimes it's very hard to see something else if you know nothing different. Hey, it's great over here. Well, I don't know that. This is all I know. But it's very clear what's happening to this most recent generation. If we go back to Proverbs, and Proverbs 12:24, which clearly states that the lazy man will be put to forced labor. And when we say the lazy man, let's think about this. What are we telling people to do? Delay adulthood, delay working, work less. If you want to stay home, play video games, get Taco Bell delivered to your house. I mean, think about that. We're having cheap, nasty food delivered to the house. Most people are playing video games, staying there. That's what we call a form of laziness. And we'll subsidize that with government subsidies, but we'll also charge you interest on the things that you don't have and you will never own. And what happens, again, the Bible says it is so crystal clear. We have to get this through. It is not free money. It is not a free meal ticket. The lazy man will be put to forced labor. And if you look at the history of communism, if you look at what Fidel Castro promised in the late 50s when he was engaging in the revolution, he's like, I'm for the poor people, right? And what happens is he comes in, and do you think he just said, yeah, keep doing? If you look at what's going on right now, Xi Jinping in China says we have 0% unemployment. Let me ask you a question. If you go over to China, do you think you're going to see obese, lazy people? Right. Do you think there's really 0% unemployment? What happens is, in a communist country, the lazy people either say, hey, you bought it, now you voted for it, guess what? You're going to work. Or, like in China, you just, hey, guess what? There's no homeless people because they disappear. You know?
And look at the homeless problem now. I mean, here's the thing, too, you want to look at. And I just encourage everyone to go look up usury. Go to YouTube, watch videos on usury. There's one called Usury, the Science of Shylock. Do some study on this so you can begin to wake up. That's all. But if you look at, Nagasaki or Hiroshima, these were places that were bombed by the atomic bomb, right? Have you seen them today? They're beautiful, thriving cities. Go look at Detroit. Now go look at Detroit back when we bombed Nagasaki or Hiroshima. It was a beautiful, thriving city. Look at Detroit now. It looks like a bomb was dropped on it. What's more dangerous, the atomic bomb or usury? Capitalism based on usury will always, always, always lead to communism. They are kissing cousins. That's the problem. We are being led into communism and despotism and tyranny by using this idea of capitalism. So it's not even a dichotomy here. Like you have to look at, okay, why was Fidel Castro so anti-American? Well, he didn't like the monetary system. He says, you know what? I don't want to be slave to this American usury-based system. So we have to have empathy and look at the enemies and say, wow, why are they pro this and why are they anti us?
Right, but Castro and the same one, the guy in South America, they both died with Castro. I think was 700 million. Who's the other guy in South America that he had over $1 billion in the bank?
Chavez.
Yeah, $1 billion. So you look what I said, and when we had Monica Crowley on the show, I said this: what you have is greed. Greed sees no political affiliation. Greed is present in capitalism. Greed is present in communism. Right? Greed is integral to the heart of man. But what happens to me in capitalism, you take Bernie Madoff, and I made this point before, and he is the poster boy for greed. Well, eventually Bernie Madoff gets caught and he gets sent to jail. My theories, though, is the same thing in communism, except in communism, it's typically the people who are in charge at the head of the government. And guess what? They don't put themselves in jail. They don't get caught. It takes a revolution to overthrow that. And we still see Cuba, 60 some odd years later, feeling the weight of that promise. If you look at this, Pew Research, which Kevin is pretty good research, the income inequality gap is always measured, and it's something every political candidate talks about, whether they're Republican or Democrat. Okay, they always talk about, I'm for who? Who am I for?
The middle class.
I'm for the middle class. And so the income inequality gap is the gap between the ultra rich and what you would call the poor. And every candidate says I'm for the middle class. But according to Pew Research, right, that the administrations, George Bush Sr., Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, right, Jr., and Barack Obama, those four things, which are the presidents during most of our adult lifetime, guess what? The income inequality gap has grown under all four presidents.
It has
not
to.
shrunk. And that should tell you something, that we're being played by a system, not by a party.
Yeah.
They always say we're for the middle class. And guess what? The rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, because exactly what Kevin's talking about.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, there's a poet, American poet, expat named Ezra Pound. He says, usury is the cancer of the world. And this is the truth. And it is a cancer in our souls, I would say, because we're relying on the world's way and our culture's way instead of God's way.
Amen.
And I think we really have to just go deep into the subject. Again, I didn't know about it. I was caught up in it. I was about $2 million in debt when I was in my penthouse condominium in Arlington, Virginia. And it wasn't bad debt. Everyone's like, you're doing great, kid. I had a business loan, SBA business loan. I had condominiums that I purchased. And then finally, I'm like, my gosh, what have I done to myself?
Yeah.
Benjamin Franklin said there's two ways to get wealthy. One's to earn more, the other's to spend less. The fastest way is to do both. And so that's what I had a really serious goal. I put a map of Costa Rica on my bathroom mirror. I'm like, how do I get out of debt and stay out of debt for the rest of my life? And I said, Costa Rica, after $2 million in debt, I started to divest, selling properties, getting rid of everything. Somehow I started earning more. I started giving more to my local church, like everything. And it just started, like, abundance started flowing through me, right? Because I was no longer in debt or enslaved to these strangers who probably didn't even share the same faith system as me. And listen, and there was a time where I was trying to keep my business afloat. The economy had turned. I lost half my members in a month. And I went to my father. I was like, Dad, could I borrow some money? He goes, oh, great. How much do you need? God bless my dad. The guy gave me 50 grand. And I proceeded to flush it down the toilet, right? I blew through it, and I paid them all back, every penny. So there are times where you have to get loans, no problem. But I didn't pay any interest on that loan. I paid my father back exactly what he loaned me. And that's being a good Christian. It's being a good Muslim. I'll tell you another story. My friend down in New Orleans, her mother owns a house and she rents it to this Muslim guy. She says, hey, why don't you just buy the house? And he told her, he goes, no, ma'am, I can't. It's against my religion to take out a loan, and I don't have the money to buy the house right now.
Wow.
wow, what a faithful guy, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
really faithful. And that opened up the conversation with my friend about usury. I'm like, it's against Catholicism and Christianity as well.
Yeah.
He was like, what? I said, yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting. It's in the, we call some of these Muslim countries enemies, whether they are or not, you have to determine that yourself. But, it's against their law to make usury-based loans. Now, the way they make money on loans is they share the risk. So if the bank said, hey, Kevin, we'll give you $300,000 for this house, but if you sell it 5 years from now for 500,000, we're going to split the profit. Or if you lose money, we take the risk on that as well. So then there's an interest for them to be associated with that. This is like a typical business loan. When you invest in a company, they're not paying you interest. They may pay you dividends because there's profit, but you're investing in that company in the hopes that you return on the investment because the price goes up in that business. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Makes a lot of
Yeah.
sense.
And
Yeah.
you know what I think as we wrap up here, if I was to say, first of all, we're going to have him back because this is just one area of expertise. And like I told him, I go, this is going to be hard to fit it all into one show. So we're going to have him back for something else. The second thing is, I think what you guys can take away this, if nothing else, is look, don't just go through life like everybody else, what they tell you, research things.
Yeah.
You mentioned the Muslim religion, and I'm friends with a Muslim guy here in town. And after talking to him, I went home and I go, you know what? I'm pretty ignorant. I said to myself, I don't even know much about the religion except from what I see on the news, what people tell me. And I started doing some research on it. And although, guys, I'm a believer in Jesus and I'm rooted in and Christianity. I was like, you know what? I have a greater respect for the religion because I realized that they believe in Jesus.
Yeah.
They believe they believe that Jesus is coming back to fight the Antichrist. There's some major things that they don't believe, like they don't believe that Jesus is the Son of God, but they do believe he was born immaculately through Mary. So there were so many things there. And as we wrap up, I was just like, you know what? If we just take it upon ourselves to educate ourselves and, like Kevin, have good discussions. Kevin and I talk all the time, and there's certain things that we're like right on, and there's certain things that I'm like, let me check that out. And if we don't agree on everything or we don't see eye to eye, it's not a make or break deal breaker. It's just like, hey, you know what? Let's facilitate that.
Yeah.
But I've learned more from him, and I think you guys have learned a lot in this conversation. And I think if you take anything away from it, Ange, I'll let you go next, but just do some research. Like, don't take things for face value, and go to the Bible. What have you taken away?
Well, I've taken a lot away, but I just want to sit here and think, and practically, if I'm a listener, I'm going, well, okay, great. Now I'm entrapped into this loan of, this home, and I'm not feeling good about it because of everything that I've just been enlightened on. Like, what are the practical steps that I take? Maybe I'm not comfortable in exchanging, my life to go to Costa Rica like Kevin. Like, what does that look like for me now? Kevin, what would you share, to our listeners, just to some practical steps of maybe, releasing those shackles a little bit?
Yeah, if you're in a ditch, and you want to get out of the ditch, the best thing to do is to stop digging, right? Like, so to take an inventory of where you are, where am I now? Where do I want to go? And then how am I going to get there? It's 3 simple questions, right? Where am I now? Okay. Where do I want to go? How am I going to get there? So really having a bigger, like Costa Rica was just mine, right? Other people, like, I want to marry the man of my dreams, or I want to go, I want to build a home in the countryside of Mississippi. Like, everyone has a different Costa Rica. That's just an example of what was mine at the time. Mine's different now, right? So put a big goal, extraordinary goal, that if it happened, like, you could only blame it on Christ, right? Like, play so big that it scares you. It's like, oh my gosh, I don't know how I'm going to do this. And let the Holy Spirit come in and lift you up to accomplish that goal. I always say my vision, God's plan, right? Sometimes it takes, sometimes I'll write out something, it happens the next day. Sometimes it's 8 years later.
Yeah.
Right. Like, I cut out a picture of Richard Branson because I thought he was an interesting guy. I read his book and I was like, I'd like to meet this guy one day. 3 years later, I'm at dinner with him in Los Angeles. 6 months after that, I'm on his island in Necker Island in the BVI's. I'm like, how in the world does this happen? I'm like, oh, of course, Jesus, right? So I think people just need to play the kind of game that's in line with who they are as a human being. Like God put a purpose in each of our heart, and each is different. We've been designed differently. Let's not corrupt that with the seeds of doubt, debt, usury, addiction, right? Like all of these things just cloud the possibilities that are right in front of us, right? So let's make sure we get a straight path. Let's make the crooked path straight. And part of that is making sure that we get out of interest-based debt to strangers who don't share the same belief system as us and aren't on the same team as us.
Yeah,
Amen.
we're just unequally yoked.
Yeah, and you know
Imagine.
what I just thought of this morning? I woke up and again I opened the Bible and it just opened up, and there's that scripture where Jesus told his apostles, he goes, "Don't take anything with you,
Yeah.
just a shirt on your back."
Yep.
And he goes, "And if you're not welcomed anywhere,
Dust your feet off.
dust your feet off." And so you don't really need a lot. If you go back to the book, you don't need a lot. You need the shirt on your back and a great attitude, and you need Jesus. And so, with that being said,
What a
I've
test.
been very blessed to have
tr-
Kevin Donahue
testimony.
here with us. I know, guys, you're going to want to share this. You're going to want to listen to it. You're going to want to share it. Give him some love. Follow him. And Ange, why don't you take us out?
Well, Kevin, let them know where they can find you first.
You can find me at Donahue KM at Instagram, Donahue KM, DONAHUE KM at Instagram. And, just really go deep into the usury. I mean, just explore it, right? Research it. And you'll find that throughout history, this has been a issue that pops up. And I think we're seeing it really, it's becoming in our face right now.
Well, thank you for enlightening us. It's been awesome.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the idea of being turned on it so that we can see things differently. And you certainly shed light on a very important topic that many of us walk around blindly not knowing. And I appreciate that. Kevin, thank you so much for being here. For our listeners, I hope this turned you on today.
Thank you, guys.